Thank you so much for coming. Tonight we're going to, it's a bit of an experiment because we've never run this particular session before. I'm going to start off giving you some of the background and the science. Don't panic, I'll make it accessible, to what happens in the brain and why adverse experience affects us in the way it does. And then Jane is going to take you through some of the practical ways that actually affects a mother and child interaction. And then if there's time at the end, and I hope there will be, we're going to do a little bit of EFT together, some tapping, to show you how that actually stabilises your neurology. And it's something that's really effective with children, so it's particularly something I wanted to show you. Okay, without further ado, I think we'll begin. If this works. Oh, it does, that's handy. Right, so just a little outline of what we're going to cover. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain structure and function and something called neuroplasticity. Has anybody heard of the term neuroplasticity? Yeah, a few people? Yeah. You all know that your brains are malleable. I'm going to talk a lot about that. So that's fantastic. And then I'm going to look at stress and the T word, trauma, which I'm told I mustn't use because it scares people. But it's a real thing and it affects all of us. So we better talk about it. And then I'll give some definitions and examples which I hope some of you can relate to, either in your own lives or in those of the people you know or work with. Have we got any teachers here or ex-teachers or... Yes, lovely, yes we have, yeah. Practitioners, people at work with, yeah. So we've got a nice broad mix of people here. And human beings, any of those here? Because that's the third category who are affected by this information. So all of us are going to need to know this stuff. I'm going to drill down a little into what early childhood experience does and how it changes the brain function. And then we're going to look in detail at attachment and attunement. And that's a reaction between mother and child. It's a sort of a mirroring, if you like. And then Jane's going to take over and do her thing and talk through how mother and baby interact and how that affects children as they develop. And then, as I say, if there's time, we're going to do a few other things, but the main thing we're going to do is do some safety and grounding work together and show you how that actually changes the way you feel. All ready to go? Okay, brilliant. So, brains, what do they look like? A lump of, I guess, sort of grey matter, really. Grey, yellowy, jelly-like stuff. So this is our common view of the brain, anyway. But it has a deeper structure. It has something going on in the middle. And it's the middle and hind parts of the brain which are the most important for behaviour and how we feel in the world. And it's those parts I'm going to address today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the cortex as well, but it's the middle part that's the key here. Okay, so everybody, you've probably heard of left brain, right brain, kind of left brain, right brain people, left brain activities, right brain activities. It's been hugely simplified to the point where we now categorise ourselves as, you know, being one or the other, which of course is nonsense. We're always both. At any one time, our hemispheres are talking to each other. That's the two lobes either side of the midline. And they have different functions, it's true. By the way, this is true for a right-handed person. Any left-handers here? Yay, switch it round. Okay. So my family, we have two left-handers and two right-handers. Really interesting. So basically, left brain thinking tends to be analytical, logical, rational, detail-oriented. And you all know people like that. You may be one yourself. You may be more lateralized to the hemisphere that deals with that. It's more verbal as well. It's more, logical and rational. The other side tends to be more emotional, less logical, and more intuitive, more bigger picture thinking as compared to detail. So creative work tends to happen in the right hemisphere, painting, music, weirdly mathematics, which tends to be, although it's considered a detail, it's quite musical in its form in some ways. So we're all a mixture, and the way the two hemispheres talk to each other is really important. How well you're able to solve puzzles, how well you're able to deal with life's problems. And so encouraging a good dialogue between the left and the right is really important, and we'll come to that later. But you'll be glad to know, as an entirely female audience, that women do it much better. Because we have a thicker neural plexus now, I'm throwing scientific words at you now. The corpus callosum is a band of neural tissue that links the left and the right, and women's are thicker. That doesn't mean it's a good thing, because it means we actually can multitask and communicate between the left and the right much better than most men can do. Now that's a generalisation, and you'll all know some women who are hopeless at that and some men who are really good at it. So please don't accuse me of being sexist, but it's just an anatomical difference, and I think it's an important one. If any of you are interested in this left brain, right brain stuff, there's a fantastic book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary. The master being, I guess, the logical brain, and the emissary being the right brain, intuitive side. Or you could say it's the other way around. But he's also got some fantastic YouTube videos as well, and TED Talks and so on. And he's a fascinating guy, very interesting man who's done a lot of research on this. So I really recommend that. Now there's the other parts of the brain beyond and beneath this wrapping cortical structure. And it maps really beautifully to the development of Homo sapiens, the human being, in that actually we've got this sort of early brain stem, it's at the back actually, and it's inherited from reptiles, so it's sometimes called the reptilian brain, and it's all about basic needs, getting your basic needs met, eating, sleeping, there's another one which I won't mention, reproduction, let's call it. So that's a very basic brain, and we all have that one. And then overlaid on top of that, wrapped around it in the middle of the brain, is the limbic system, or mammalian brain. And that's about emotions, about the state of the organism, how we feel in the world. It has lots of really important functions actually for behaviour. And then of course the cortex and the neocortex, the human brain that we've just talked a little bit about. So you've got this evolution from this to this, and what's really interesting is that nature in its wisdom hasn't sort of reinvented itself and reorganised everything, it's just overlaid one on top of the other. So we've got these three brains, which is why it's called a triune three-brain structure. Not only is that the evolutionary pathway of the human, it's also the developmental pathway of a human baby. And we'll see that it starts off pretty basic and it gets more complicated as the baby develops. So these are the two important ones for our discussion today. Limbic mammalian brain and reptilian brain, because they're the ones that really run the show. It's quite shocking because we think we're all logical and organised and super rational beings, and actually most of the time you're actually organising your life around these two. These are the ones that tell you how you feel. So, okay, so we've got this three-layered evolution from reptiles to a mammalian brain to the neocortex, the rational or thinking brain. So in evolutionary terms then, we've developed this triune structure for a reason. The last brain to develop was the neocortex because it became necessary for human beings to deal with much more complex situations than, say, early mammals. And as I've said, that's kind of mirroring what happens with a child when it's born and how it develops latterly. So it's interesting to know that your cortex isn't fully developed until you're, well, about 23, 24 for women and about 26, 27 for men. Which is why I think, and excuse me, I'm going to sound sexist again, but I think, young men tend to be rather disinhibited. They haven't got the cortical structures that would normally give them a three-dimensional view of things. It's very impulsive. And so I guess they pay more for their driving insurance than girls do. But it has this actual structural reasoning. It's that the cortex is not fully online until you are in your mid-20s. And so there's this whole process of the brain changing and growing with you. Now, a really important point is that those first two, the reptilian and the mammalian brain, are subconscious. In other words, they're below conscious awareness. So they're ruling the show without you knowing about it. And they're not telling you much. They're just giving you feelings and sensations, and you don't always know, therefore, why you feel the way you do or why you do the things you do. Ever had that experience in life? You've just said something, it's come out of your mouth and you wish you hadn't, or you've no idea why you said it the way you did. It's an irrational and somewhat emotional response to something, and it's not logical at all. Now, the reason we have these subconscious parts of our brain is because it's a survival mechanism to keep us functioning. And therefore, we don't want to know when our heart speeds up or slows down or whether our bladder's filling. So we need to keep it subconscious, otherwise we'd be overwhelmed with all the sensations and information. So it has a mechanism and a reasoning for why it is unconscious. But that can cause us problems, because as I've said, we are largely then unconsciously driven creatures. And I guess that's what I'm hoping to do today, is to show you how to master your unconscious process, to actually get a handle on why you feel the way you do and start to intelligently influence it and change it and make it work for you better. And if any of you are interested on this developmental cycle and the origins of the human brain, Alan Shaw has written a book called, and it's a rather technical title, Affect Regulation, that means emotional regulation, and the Origins of Self. It's a great title. It's quite a serious book, but it's got a lot of really good information in there. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to your friend, the emotional limbic system and the brainstem. We all have one. It sits in the middle of our brains, so if my thumb was the limbic system and the cortex wraps around it. Now, you've got several parts to that, and some of these terms you've come across, some of you, and some of you won't have done, but don't worry too much, because there are really only two that are really, really important for our purposes, the hippocampus and the amygdala, or perhaps also the hypothalamus. But anyway, so you've got actually two lobes. That's the reason why I've shown it in 3D and not the usual just slice through, is because you've actually got two sides. Just like the hemispheres, there are two sides of everything here as well. So there are actually two hippocampi and two amygdalae, which are there. So, and they have slightly different functions as well, which I won't have time to go into today. But in general, they all have a function. Hypothalamus, hypo, underneath the thalamus. There's the thalamus in blue, hypothalamus underneath it. So nice and easy to remember that one. Is your stress response. It's how you perceive threat or safety in your environment. And by environment, I don't just mean what happens outside you, I also mean what happens within you. You know, when your blood acidity rises, or blood pressure, or any other physiological change in your body is perceived by these parts of your brain. And it's there, as I said, to regulate your system. So You've got the hypothalamus. There's another one called the insula, and that's a bit higher, actually. It's sort of over the top of this. It's a bit of a relay station. It processes a lot of sensory information. And very importantly for us, it gives us empathy with others. The ability to predict what other people are thinking and feeling and to connect with that. So you can imagine if that part of your brain goes a little bit awry, you're going to really struggle to understand other people. You're going to struggle to connect with others. Amygdala is, I think it's Greek. Don't get me if that's wrong, but I think it's Greek, or it could be Latin, but I think it's Greek for almond, because it's almond shaped. And it basically is your smoke alarm or threat detector, and it tells you what's going on if anything bad is happening in your environment, and it gives you the motivation to do something about it. But it's basically a fear center of the brain. Thalamus is a bit of a cook. It sort of brings in everything and mixes it up and sort of gives you a sensory input composed of all the different sight, sound, touch, those inputs. Sort of gives you a flavour of what's going on. And then the hippocampus is a very important thing that date stamps. It gives what event is happening. It actually gives it a date and a time, so that your brain is aware that something is happening now, and obviously once it's been processed, that it's over. So hippocampus tells you when something has happened of the time and the date of that event. We'll see the importance of that in a minute. And finally, your prefrontal cortex, which is sort of back of the hemispheres that meet this limbic system area. That's really about the thinking part. It's the sort of mediation between the cortex and the limbic system, and it helps you to process stuff and analyse and predict what might be happening in the future based on what's happened in the past. Now, toxic, this is a new term. I've only just come across this, and I think it's a really good way of looking at it. Toxic stressful experience, in other words, emotional trauma, landscapes the brain. It changes the way the brain functions and can therefore change your mind and your body for the rest of your lifetime. There's a little proviso here: unless mitigated, unless dealt with, unless you do something to process some of this stuff. We'll see in a minute, but time does not erase trauma. Time does not heal in this particular instance. Normal memory, normal bad experiences are changed over time, and we do get over them, but traumatic ones are deeply embedded in our system, in our mind and body. It's not just a problem with the mind. So with threat, fear, and certain forms of stress, the brain changes, it landscapes itself according to what's been happening. And certain parts shrink and certain parts grow. These are the two that tend to grow: your stress response and your threat detector or smoke alarm. So you can see then immediately stress makes you more likely to detect threat. So it becomes a self-sustaining loop. And the parts that shrink are the ones that give you context and date stamping and an ability to process. And so we can become very immobilized, we can become very frozen when these events happen. And I want to show you a little bit about what sort of events I'm talking about. But the basic message here is that stressful experience, if it's of a very high intensity, can change your brain permanently, unless it's, changed. And the reason for that is the thing that I mentioned earlier, which is neuroplasticity. This idea that brains are not lumps of matter. They are a process in motion consisting of billions and trillions, billions of neurons and trillions of connections between those neurons. Neurons are nerve cells. And the connections form as a result of the experience of your life. So they're not just there like we used to believe when I was doing biology at school, goodness knows, many years ago. We were told that you were born with all the neurons you would ever have, and then they decayed over your lifetime, and that was that, bad luck if it decayed quickly, and, if you were lucky, you wouldn't decay so quickly. We now know that that's actually not true, that the brain adapts to its environment and it very much makes the most of its experience. So if the experience that it has is positive, the connections grow well and they form adaptive loops. If the experience you have is, limiting and dangerous, the sorts of connections that form are very much more fixed. They don't adapt so well. And this is what neuroplasticity is, the ability of your neurons to connect with each other throughout your life. When a child is first born, we know that human babies, compared to, say, any other, if you look at a horse, if a horse gives birth to a foal, the foal will get up within about an hour and start walking. They are much more mature when they're born in terms of their physiology and their brain function. Human babies are incredibly immature, and there's a reason for that. It's a sort of trade-off because we have such large brains and women only have a certain size pelvis, and to get a large head through a small pelvis means we have to have immature brains when we're born. So that baby's brain is constantly adapting to its environment, even before it comes into the world, actually, even in the womb during pregnancy. It's actually adapting already to the environment that it's in, whether the mother is stressed, whether she's eating well or not, the kind of thoughts that are going around in her head, all create internal dynamics which are picked up by the baby's brain. And then when it comes into the world, probably 0 to 7 is the time when most of the connections start to form at the greatest rate, let's say. I mean, I've already said neuroplasticity continues throughout life, but the ages of 0 to 7 are really, really crucial for a child's brain. The cortex at this point, these two hemispheres, are not really online at all. They're coming on between sort of 7-ish, 7 and 9, starting to give context and logic and reason. But before that, children are very impulsive, aren't they? They're needy, they know, they just do what they feel. And we love them for that. But we need to make sure they have the right environment in which to learn this overlay, this idea of controlling their impulses and trusting themselves to make decisions and anticipate the future and those sorts of things. Now, another period of great growth is adolescence. And this is a very important point, I think, for why we're suffering a huge amount of mental ill health in this country and elsewhere. This period, sort of around the time of puberty and after, is another period of great adaptation in the brain when a thing called pruning occurs. Pruning is a natural getting rid of certain unused or unnecessary connections as far as the brain is concerned. And it basically decides that we can't sustain that number for the rest of our life, so we'll only keep the ones we need according to our experience. And this pruning happens with everybody. But early stress and adversity, and there's also a thing about genetic predisposition as well, cause us to prune too much too early. And so when we get to the normal adolescent pruning stage, you know what I mean. Pruning is like a great term, I think, because it sort of comes from gardening, where you take off all the excess foliage, and it's that sort of thing. So you've had too much going on too soon in the child's brain, and then you get the normal adolescent pruning overlaid on that. Means we end up with not enough neuronal connections to actually sustain ourselves healthily. We then are vulnerable to all sorts of mood disorders, depression, anxiety, and we're seeing an absolute explosion of that in our young people at the moment. I don't know if any of you are aware of that. I get people coming to me. I don't get a lot of young people, but when I do, they say, you know, in my class or my university course, there's at least 3 of us who have, you know, overdosed, and there, you know, many are self-harming, and it's an absolute epidemic, and it's just tragic. So these early experiences are really vital. Now, all is not lost. Even if you have a toxic stress experience, or many in your adolescence and childhood, you can still start to change things as an adult. And that's why, you know, our message today is of hope. We're not trying to make you feel terrible or depressed about this. We're just trying to highlight some of the things that are happening and show you that you can actually make changes even in adulthood. Because we've got this lovely neuroplasticity idea that what wires together fires together. In other words, the more you think a certain thought or do a certain thing, that neural connection becomes strengthened and enhanced. So imagine if you are a depressive person, and every morning you get up and you think, my life is rubbish, it's terrible. That thought becomes habitual and very, very entrenched, and your brain just responds to that. Okay, my life is rubbish. That's how we're going to run your life. And so you get more of the same. But if we change that feeling, then we're likely to actually fire up new neuronal connections that change that feeling and say, actually, I've got hope today. My life isn't so rubbish. So another problem with toxic stress is that we have a system in our brains which has only recently been discovered. We used to think the brains were sterile, and they're actually not. They have a microbiome, they have a set of bacteria that live with them. And we also have things called microglia, which are helper cells that live around and amongst the cerebral fluid, and they actually help support the neurons in your brain and basically keep them clean and functioning well. They're like the cleaners, if you like, in the system. Now, with toxic stress, microglia pick up this message of threat, and they start to secrete certain chemical signals which signal inflammation in the brain, something we call neuroinflammation. And you've probably heard of that with regard to Alzheimer's. I guess you have, that it's an inflammatory process, and it happens from pretty much the middle age until you are elderly. But it also happens in children, and it happens in all of us if we're subjected to levels of stress that we simply can't control. And what happens with that is it sort of sets the brain on a new path and resets it neurologically. Come back. Making it just very... instead of being stable, it actually destroys neurons which would normally replace less functioning ones. You normally have to have a turnover to keep things functioning well. And this neuroinflammation means that they just destroy the new ones coming along on stream, and so you're just left with poorly functioning nerve cells in your brain, which of course gives us depression and anxiety. And if you've managed to get through your childhood without that, you can often find that you experience that in your adult life. And I don't know if any of you have had depression or anxiety. I have. Age 34 it hit me, and I'd always been a really high-functioning person, I would like to say, you know, really A-type. Any other A-types here, you know, getting things done and go, go, go? That was me. Depression and anxiety, when they hit you, are not like a bad day. It's not something you get over, because it's actually an organic problem in your brain. And so we need to take this stuff seriously, and we need to offer people answers that aren't simply taking tablets to restore one chemical in the brain, which at the moment we have a very limited palette to offer people medically. Oh, and just a few numbers here. 1.8 million neural connections per day at the height of your brain development, which is about the age of 2. Any of you seen the programme about the 4-year-olds and the old people's home? Anybody watch that one? It's on TV. I watched it last night. Those children are at the height of their neuronal development. They're sort of age 3 and 4, and they're inquisitive and they're learning, and you can see their brains whirring as they learn about things and try and negotiate. And of course, the elderly people are at the end of their period of neuronal growth, and they're sort of adjusting to this. But even they have neural plasticity, and that's what the experiment is aiming to show, is that they can function better once they've been around young people who stimulate their neuronal connections. It's a fantastic show. It's actually quite heartwarming as well as being educational. Anybody interested in more about this should look up Dan Siegel. He's writing on interpersonal neurobiology. And if you fancy a good book for bedtime, probably not, it's a little bit dense, but it's a really good book, Childhood Interrupted. I'm reading that at the moment, Donna Jackson Nakazawa. And it's an exceedingly good book, very well written about childhood trauma. Now, I did want to, I added this one in recently because I didn't want to make you all feel terrible and guilty about raising children who've had stress in their lives, okay? Because we all have stress in our lives. And that isn't the point of today at all. It's really to show you that there are types of stresses that are bad and types of stresses that are tolerable. There are positive stresses, things that are brief, mild in intensity, and there are adults who are caring and responsive around the child that help to reset the stress response back to baseline. So something like your first day at school. I remember mine. Must have been stressful because I remember it. But I remember I didn't cry. There's a surprise. But the girl who became my best friend was in floods of tears, and my mum says that I held her hand and gave her a cuddle kind of thing. So that, I remember it, but I'm not traumatized by it because there were people around who were there to support me, and that's very, very important. Tolerable stresses would be moderate to high intensity, but with a protective adult relationship, the child can adapt over time. So something like the death of a grandparent, or even, God forbid, a parent, can be adapted to if there's somebody else or a team of people around that child to help support them get through it and understand that their sorrow is normal and that their grieving is important. They need to be heard and supported. But then there's this bottom layer, and this is what we're now hearing termed toxic stress. And that's usually strong in intensity and frequent or prolonged in timing. So this activates the body's stress response, but it doesn't switch off because it's too intense, there's no buffering, maybe there's no adults around who support the child, maybe the people that are causing the stress are the parents themselves or the family system. And here obviously includes things like child abuse, neglect, parental substance abuse, if your parents are addicted, or and even maternal depression actually counts in that. So maternal depression or postnatal depression is incredibly common, and nobody's saying that it's your fault because it's just your brain neurochemistry goes out. Has anybody had that? Yeah. And it's not your fault, it's just what happens. But it can cause a very big shift in your child's neurology because, and I know Jane will go into this, how the child and the mother bond in those early months can be hugely disrupted by that. So we're not about blame here or shaming anybody. This is about hope and empowerment and showing you that you can change these things even in adult life, and you can certainly support the children that you know and that are in your care to come through these situations. I've heard of a term called CUTS, by the way. That's a new one. Child Unpredictable Toxic Stress, which I thought was quite a nice phrase. But we call it trauma. I call it trauma. And sometimes I call it unresolved emotion, because there is a great link between traumatic memory and emotions, which I'll show you. Trauma is any event where helplessness is present. Helplessness means there's nobody around to help assuage the event for you. And it's recorded by your limbic system, which you all know now where that is, for future avoidance, because you don't want to feel helpless. It's a real problem, because obviously being helpless is interpreted by your body as a threat to survival. It's very serious. And so the brain has this ancient mechanism for recording these kinds of events, and we call it implicit memory. It's very different to normal memory. It's a feeling state, and it's non-verbal, it's wordless, it doesn't have any words, it isn't something that you could remember as a sentence. You remember it as a feeling. And I'm sure there's a few of you here thinking, I have a few feelings like that, and I've always wondered. They're formed early in life, before the cortex comes online, so usually before the age of 7, and they are completely unconscious because you haven't got the conscious awareness at that point. How you are reminded of them is by unconscious triggers. So similar emotions in your adult life or your adolescent life, the sounds, the sights, the smells that remind you of another time in your life that was dangerous or threatening to you. So we call that a trigger, and it's very, very common, and it can be absolutely anything. Can you think of an example? I can think of one. Smells, very evocative, aren't they? If you ever, somebody brought me some rose, I think it was rose water or something, a couple of weeks ago, and I was immediately taken back to a time in my childhood, because my father was a rose grower and he was very keen on roses, and we were always making rose perfume from the leaves. Or actually, it wasn't very pleasant, but roses will take me straight back to being 4 or 5, very clearly. The important thing about this kind of memory, this implicit memory, is it's persistent. It doesn't decay, it doesn't vary. You know, normal memory is embellished, isn't it? You might have a memory of, I don't know, you were 8 and your mother was going out for the evening and she was wearing a pair of white stilettos, and you'll say to her, "Oh, Mum, I remember when you were wearing those white stilettos," and she'll say, "I never had any white stilettos." Don't know what you're talking about, because you've transposed another image over that, where maybe it was a lady in the street or it was an auntie, but your brain has embellished and added on layers. That's normal explicit memory. And it varies and it sort of changes over your lifetime. Implicit memory isn't like that. It's absolutely fixed because it's survival based. It's also the meaning of the event, not the event itself, that's really important. So it's the meaning to you. It's individual to you. So 2 people in the same family can have the same event happen to them, and one will respond with, "Oh, well, that's bad, but I'll get over it," and the other is totally destroyed by it because of their individual neurology and biochemistry. And it's the unpredictability of the experience which makes it so threatening. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in regard to attachment as well. That's what makes attachment so threatening to the system, is because we're hardwired to connect to our caregivers. So unpredictability means the nervous system can't adjust. So if I was to, I don't know, ring a really loud bell in here, but I did it every minute, you'd get to the point where you'd be really annoyed with me, but you'd predict it. It wouldn't be so stressful. But if I did it randomly at any time, and constantly, it would start to really eat away at you, and you'd start to find that your nervous system would feel really unbalanced by that. Adverse childhood experience is a really important understanding because it's become really fashionable to talk about ACEs now. There was a conference actually in Glasgow about a month ago, or actually might only be 3 weeks. Over 1,000 people attended from all over Europe. ACEs are really the big thing now to understand. So I'm going to take you through some of this understanding because it affects your lifetime health outcome more than heart disease or cancer, believe it or not, because it causes heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, you name it. Most disease is caused by stress. We know that now. Stress causes inflammation and inflammation causes disease. But what if your stress is unconscious stress, if it's this kind of toxic, implicit memory type? It's really interesting to know that if you had more than 6 adverse childhood events in your life, you have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and get this, up to a 20-year difference in life expectancy. 20 years less life. So if in your family you have people, my mum's a twin, and she's still alive, but her twin sister died this year, which is, I know a lot of you probably have heard of twin studies. Scientists do a lot of studies on twins because they find them biologically very interesting because they have the same genetics, but they don't have the same life experience. Because no 2 people have the same life experience, even if they grow up in the same family. Now, my mother obviously had the same parents as her sister, but she was separated from her sister when she was, well, just after she was born, and she went to live with her maternal grandmother. Lucky for her, because my mother's still here, because the maternal grandmother was actually a very loving and sweet lady, and I remember her. She died when I was about 9. But my grandmother was a fearsome woman. She was not really what you'd call a natural mother. And I think she was totally overwhelmed by having twins, because in those days you didn't always know. You didn't know until you popped them out, and then that's what happened. So, okay, so my mum's still going. Her twin sister, not a huge difference. We don't know how long my mum's going to live, but already you can see the effects of that happening. If any of you are interested, there's a fantastic TED Talk. Do you all know what TED Talks are? They're online. They're sort of ideas worth having, they're called. Nadine Burke-Harris has done a lot of work on this. She was one of the people that brought this to our attention. And there's a lady called Nikki Greatrix as well, who she's English, but she lives in California now, and she does a lot of talks on adverse childhood experience. And if any of you are really fascinated to check out the original study, it's acestudy.org. But you'll see that basically you've got these adverse childhood experiences live at the base of everything we are. They affect our social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, our adoption of certain behaviours, therefore, and then our disease and early death if we have too many of them. So the ACE study then was a study that was set up in 1997, and it ran for 2 years. Originally, 17,000 adults were asked about their early childhood experience. Can you believe this has never been done before? As far as I know, nobody has run a study like this before this time, because it simply wasn't considered important. And CDC is the Centers for Disease Control. It's an American organisation, and KP is Kaiser Permanente. That's one of the HMOs, health maintenance organisations. They have a very different system in the US. And basically, it's an insurance-based system over there, and they wanted to find out, to cut down their insurance bill, if they could predict certain outcomes based on certain features. And they were looking originally at why people who went on a health weight loss program, some of them lost loads of weight, but then as soon as they stopped the program, they gained it all back on with extra. And there was a lead scientist there who wondered why that might be, and he wanted to find out what was different about these people who put the weight all back on as compared to the ones who stayed healthy. And the answer turned out to be their childhood experiences. And then he did a paper on this, and then another scientist came along who said, this is really fascinating stuff, we need to do a bigger study, and then they did this bigger study. They asked 17,000 adults. These are middle class, insured, mostly white, mostly wealthy people, because they've got health insurance, and in the US you have to be fairly well-heeled to have that. You have to have a good job. So when they found out this result, that 28% reported physical abuse and 21% reported sexual abuse out of this cohort, this was really shocking. And almost 40% of the original sample reported 2 or more of these adverse childhood events, and 12.5% had 4 or more. So it really blew out of the water the idea that all of us have nice childhoods and our health outcome has nothing to do with what happens to us in life. It has a dose-response relationship. I'll show you that on the next slide. But that always tells us, what that means is the more events you have, the worse your health outcome. And it's a good clue in science for an association, what we call a strong association. And further studies have now supported this finding. For instance, over 50% of women with IBS report childhood trauma. There's a link, and it's to do with the nervous system. If you have 7 or more, you have a 360% greater risk of heart disease. And children whose parents divorce are more likely to have strokes as adults, etc., etc., etc. I can't give you all the results, there are far too many now. Let's have a look then at what a dose-response relationship looks like. So 0 ACEs, and risk for negative health outcome is fairly low, and as it increases, it simply increases in a fairly steady, predictable pattern. So this shows us that it's having an effect on your body. It affects your health, for sure, but it also affects your behaviours, which affect your health. So if you choose addictive behaviours, you smoke and you don't look after yourself, you're going to have worse health outcomes there. And you're also going to affect your life potential, how much you earn, how happy your relationships are, whether you're able to have stable relationships and, enjoy your life. And I thought I'd show you, don't worry about, I know this is a busy slide, this is the actual 10 questions in the Adverse Childhood Experience study. And there are 2 that I want to 3 in fact I've pointed out. Number 1, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Now I think the second half of that is obvious. That's a trauma when someone's threatening you, but to humiliate, swear at you, and put you down is an incredibly common experience. Particularly at school, actually, not just in your household, but we often find humiliation at school. But some parents do this to their children too. The next one that I think is really interesting. Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? These are incredibly common. My therapy room is full of people who've had childhoods like that. And the final one is an example of vicarious trauma, in other words, observing somebody else having an experience. So was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist? It goes on anyway. So some of these questions are very extreme, but some of them are more subtle. And anyway, for every one that you answer, yes, that's your ACE score, you add them up and that's how you get your ACE score, okay? But there is an issue, where's bereavement? Whereas, as I've said, school experience, school bullying, being sent away to school or anywhere into another country or another environment where your parents are not there. Boarding schools particularly can be very difficult for some children. Sibling rivalry. Did another sibling have special needs? Were they disruptive? Did they take all the attention? These things do have significant effects. So trauma is common. I want you to go home with the idea that, okay, be hopeful because there's things we can do, but do understand that it isn't an unusual occurrence that only happens to certain people. It happens to most of us in some way or another. It's just that some of us are more sensitized to the effects of that. Yes, there's the obvious ones. Accidents, abuse, war, violence, bereavement. But there's also birth itself. Birth is an incredible trauma, naturally so. Even when it's a good birth, it's a trauma for the child to come into the world. Suddenly everything's really different. If it's a surgical birth where a mother is confused, she's frightened, she's not feeling anything, or she's feeling too much, it can be very frightening. And birth trauma often lies at the heart of some of the things that we feel unconsciously. There's a whole wonderful field based on birth trauma called perinatal psychology. It's very, very interesting. Humiliation and bullying. Were any of you, sorry, you don't mind me, I was bullied at school. So mainly because I've got red hair, and back then it wasn't that common, and so I'd just be the butt of everybody's jokes all the time. But it does grind you down after a while. Betrayal, abandonment, these things happen. And surgery. Surgery, even dental surgery, can be really, really significant. I had a lot of dental surgery when I was young as well, with a gas mask, because I was totally needle phobic. I'm still a bit dodgy with needles. So I was gassed every time, put out, and then I'd wake up, mouthful of blood, and the whole thing was really, I can still remember the smell of the gas. So it's anything that happens when helpless, as I've said, to a sensitized brain, one that's already had that kind of early imprinting of change. And it's not the severity of the event itself. So there is no shame in this. There is no, oh, well, it wasn't very much, I shouldn't be so affected by it, but I am. If you are, you are. Your brain has registered threat, that's all. And of course, if they're multiple and cumulative, they add on to each other, particularly in childhood, which is a very powerless situation generally. We can't argue, we can't fight back, and we can't run away. Some of us try, but we can't really. And the stresses are unpredictable, and this is the issue. And by the way, it's not just something that happens when helpless, it's also something that doesn't happen when expected or needed. So that equally is a trauma. So say you needed somebody to make you feel special in your family, someone who got your back, someone who was there for you and there was no one. That's trauma. And my final bit before handing over to Jane is about attachment. Any of you heard of attachment, understand what attachment is? It's a sort of biological imprint that we have for our caregiver, for usually mother in the first instance. And I'm going to look at the neurological consequences, so what happens in your brain and your neurology. I don't know if you can read this properly, but I've tried to colour code them for a reason. This is the green one, secure. About 30% of people are securely attached in psychological terms. That means when they were young, firstborn, we're usually talking, 0 to 2, their needs were met consistently. And they learned to self-soothe because they were shown that they were safe and loved. Mother and child are mutually regulated. They understand each other instinctively and are able to regulate each other automatically. Now, I didn't have that kind of childhood. I wouldn't be standing here if I did, and I certainly wouldn't be working with all the people I work with who also didn't have this kind of childhood. If they did, they wouldn't be visiting for therapy. because this is a lovely way to come into the world and to believe in yourself and feel great. But there are 2 or 3 other layers. There are 2 insecure strategies. These are strategies for getting, for how you relate. And this I've labelled amber because it's sort of not quite so good, but it's not terrible. The child is, in this first type, ambivalent. The child is both drawn to and repelled by the caregiver. And this is actually, it's very interesting, but I'd say this is my mother, and she was presumably this kind of child because she's become this kind of adult. So she would prefer to have someone else regulate her, someone else to cuddle her, someone else to make her feel good about herself. But as soon as they get close, she pulls away, and she still does that now. So if I go to cuddle her, she'll go, ooh, and then she'll pull away because it's uncomfortable for her. She doesn't know what to do. And that's usually where the mother was confused or confusing. She was both wanting to love you but not sure how. And then there's this other insecure type, which is the opposite. And we tend to meet the opposites in our life. We tend to be attracted to the opposite in this. Very rare to find a couple, for instance, who are both avoidant or both ambivalent. They generally are the opposite. So the avoidant type, and that's me, will reject the parent and show a preference for distraction. So I'd play with my toys, I'd draw, I'd paint, I'd do anything rather than cuddle mummy. And self-regulation. So I would go inwards and find my own relative peace. It wasn't very successful. Rather than connecting with others. And this is still a style that you'll carry on throughout your life, by the way. This isn't just what you adopt in childhood and then you stop. You tend to have a preference for the attachment style that you developed when you were young. Now, I went to a conference at the weekend with Hay House. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're a publisher of self-help and spiritual books. And the room was full of fabulously ambivalent people, and they're all up there singing, dancing, screaming at each other, being all really vibrant. And I'm sat in the corner thinking, I can't do that. I can't show off in public. I can't sing in public, because that's my style. Of course I can, but it's a real effort for me. So some of you may recognise some styles in your family from that little description. Hopefully there's nobody in your family who has a totally disorganised strategy, but it's more common than you think. Here, nothing works. I have a couple of clients at the moment like this, and they're highly dysregulated. Their nervous systems are all over the place. The autonomic nervous system, by the way, is the type of nervous system that runs your unconscious process, your heart rate, your breathing, your bladder, your kidneys, and so on. And these people have not learned to balance themselves. They don't know how to self-soothe, and they don't know how to get soothing from other people either. And they tend to have tendencies, what we call dissociative tendencies. They often faint. I met a lady who constantly fainted throughout her life, her adult life. Without warning, she just faints. Trance-like states. We tend to think of trance as being, something you do in hypnosis, but it happens regularly every day when we're driving to work and we forget how we got there. That's a trance state. But children who do this often go blank. And they often are the good babies. They're the ones that don't complain, don't cry, they're just blank. It's not necessarily a good thing, it can be a problem. It's that they've left their bodies behind. Their brains have gone elsewhere. They've disconnected from their internal experience because it's too painful. Rocking. I see knee jigglers. Have you seen those people? Knee jigglers, those ones? It's an old habit that they've developed of rocking themselves. It's comforting. But sometimes, in extremes, you'll see people who do this as well. Bedwetting is a very common feature of this, and there's so many people I meet who are so ashamed of this happening to them. And it's completely unconscious, and it's not something they can control. and of course addictions and compulsions. So we tend to see more mental health problems in this group. But please understand, these are not rigid boundaries. As I said, these are tendencies, and you'll tend to one or another, but you will move between them as well. And if you have somebody who intervenes in your life and gives you security, and it might not be your parents, it might be somebody, you know, an aunt, or I even had somebody with a lovely neighbour who used to take her in and look after her. You can become more secure because of that. So you can kind of move up these states depending on who's around. And my final slide is about attunement as well. And this is something Jane's going to develop for you. So the early bonding behaviours between mother and child are mostly sensory. Would you agree? Touch, sound, hearing her voice. Something called voice prosody is where, you know, how we talk to children and animals. Who's a lovely boy then? You're so beautiful. Lots of variation in the tone, ups and downs, and eye gaze is really important for humans. So when a mother smiles and coos at you and you see crinkles in her eyes which show affection and love. By the way, people who don't have crinkles in their eyes, be wary, okay? They're not feeling their emotions, they're highly dissociated or sadly autistic. That's another feature of autism. But so the way that the mother interacts with the baby is really important. Now, when you get this early disruption of the bond, the result is a constant triggering of the stress response in the baby, and they become hypersensitive to threat, to things that happen around them. And it can translate to everything. I have some clients who are sensitive to everything. Supplements, listening to audios if I give them relaxation tapes. Sends them into hyper arousal instead of relaxing them, because it's a change. It's something changing in their system, and their system is so geared to threat, it sees all change as threat. So we can become very, very hypersensitized. And then once that's sort of a pattern, mother and child really both feel the lack. And this happened to me. So my mum and I were not close when I was young. We both felt the lack, but we didn't know what to do about it. We weren't very good, and we would try, and sometimes she would try and hug me or put bows in my hair. I remember that really well. Dressing me up, making me go on stage when I was young. I used to have to go on stage and perform. Well, here I am again, but you know, I absolutely hated it. She used to dress me up in fancy dress and all sorts, trying to show me she loved me. But of course, I just took it as humiliation, because it was the worst thing for an avoidant person to be shoved in front of everyone else. So we never were able to give each other comfort or soothing. And I lost self-trust, trust in my own experience, trust in what was right for me, because I couldn't speak up for myself. Somebody did ask me at the last time I presented this information, what about fathers? So I thought I'd add that. Fathers are really important, but they come into the child's life a little bit later, so from 6 months onwards. And, you know, a good father can mitigate a distracted or depressed mother. So fathers are really key. They basically help you develop this sense of internal trust in yourself, or neuroception, a sense of who you are in the world. And this is something that's just so vital for feeling good, for feeling connected to who you are and to other people. Moving us on, just before we finish, to how we can deal with both prevention and healing, because I think it's really important to end on a positive, after having told you all the pitfalls and all the difficulties, to allow you to understand that there are things you can do, there are resources out there that you can use for yourselves, your families, your communities. And one of the first things I would suggest you have a look at is taking a resilience questionnaire or test yourself, and just find out on acestoohigh.com. I had a look at that today. It's a really good little 28-question questionnaire. And just see for yourself, how high is your score? Is there something maybe that you need to look at? If you get a positive sense that there is some stuff in your past, or maybe those are the people you love, there are things you can do that kind of use your brain's ability to change, to work, to heal yourself. And writing is I know you may wonder how that works, but this workshop that I was at the weekend, we were encouraged to write to ourselves now from our 8-year-old self and our 80-year-old self. What would your 8-year-old self tell you? What would your 80-year-old self tell you? And I'm one of the, as I said, I'm an avoidant, so I don't like anything like this. But I decided I'm going to do it, and I'm just going to open my heart and write down what I think my 8-year-old self would say. And my 8-year-old self is amazed, because she's like, what are you doing standing up in front of people? You're shy. I'm really amazed you're doing that, but well done. That's good. And my 80-year-old self is saying, you had a wonderful life. You didn't shirk. You didn't turn away from difficult things. And it just energized me. It made me think, so keep on doing what you're doing, It's a real gift to see yourself as others see you. And sometimes we don't give ourselves that. So have a go at that one. Drawing, mindfulness, anything body-based, Tai Chi, yoga, all helped you connect with your body and a sense of self. If you feel you've got more issues, you might consider trauma release via trauma-informed therapies, perhaps going to see somebody to do body work, somatic experiencing. There are so many different things you can do now to heal yourself. Guided imagery, I use that a lot with people, taking them to a time that was difficult and allowing their current self to hold and cuddle the self that was vulnerable. You can do that in imagination, and you wouldn't believe the effect it has on your current life, because you're carrying around an imprint of all the times you were lonely, all the times you were struggling. And when you release yourself by taking yourself back in imagination, it releases you in the here and now. There are lots of modern apps you can download that help you these days, and there's one, Heart Math Institute have one which helps you work on your heart rate variability. I haven't got time to go into that. It's another thing you can do. So modern technology is there for you as well. And one thing I'm going to show you today, I'm going to show you emotional freedom technique, and another one that I use, which I haven't got time to show you, but that uses eye movements as well, which is fantastic for trauma. What we must do is heal our childhood wounds. As Jane has said, sometimes we end up otherwise parenting or having relationships from the point of view of a wounded person. And this is seldom good. And I speak from experience. Relationships that, I am acting out old stuff in the here and now based on these old imprints, completely unconsciously, and the person I'm with is doing the same. And you wonder why so many, relationships don't work out. We need to make the unconscious conscious. We need to bring it into consciousness in order to change it. And there is a biological reason for that, which I haven't got time to go into today. But mainly we have to learn to feel safe again. Because when we've had these experiences that have wounded us, even if they're just one-off things, we find it hard to feel safe internally. Internal safety is not the same as knowing that if I go out there, I'm not going to be run over. It's a sense of feeling right in my body, okay, good enough. And you can deal with that, as I said, with various means. The main thing that safety allows you to feel grounded in the here and now. And when you do that, you can change anything. And you need to bring curiosity and awareness to that. That's why mindfulness is such a big deal currently. because you're bringing your cortex online when you become aware of something, when you study it and think, oh, I'm having that feeling, that's a strange feeling, I wonder what that is. Then you stop reacting habitually and unconsciously. So you learn that you can be here, now, instead of there, then. And a lot of us are reacting as if we're there then, a lot of the time. What this does is it then disconnects the memory and the emotion. So you still have the memory, but you're no longer pulled by it, you're no longer drawn by it, you're no longer affected by it to the point where you're reenacting it in your current life unconsciously. And the other thing it does is it changes your brain waves. And if I could wire up people and show you the before and the afters, some people are doing that now actually, there's a lot of research on this, showing how your brainwave states really influence how you feel. It's just one of the many things that impact you. And if you get into an alpha state, which you do when it's not about being relaxed, it's about being in the flow. Have you ever felt in the flow? You know, where everything, the lights are all green. And I had one experience of that once. I've had many experiences of it, I should say, but one I remember really well was suddenly I could play pool. Well, I can't play pool, but I was hitting every ball into the pocket. And it lasted about 20 minutes, and I was so amazed, and I didn't know what was happening. I had no idea why suddenly I was able to do it. It's because I'm in a flow state, and I'm lining up properly, and I'm confident and relaxed. That's alpha brainwaves. All right, so it's 9:10, so I would like to have talked to you about the vagus nerve. Runs all the way down the body, from sort of the back of the brain all the way down, all the internal organs, and also your head and face as well. And that's why the vagus nerve carries most of the information about our unconscious body state. I don't have time to go into polyvagal theory. Maybe next time, if any of you are keen, we'll talk about that. But I thought what we'd do before we end is just have a little demo together, because it's quite nice to do these things in a group before we part for the evening. Have any of you done tapping? Ever done it before? Any yeses? Yeah, a few people. So if you haven't, I think it's quite a nice one to end up on. So, and as I say, it's great with kids. Now with kids, you wouldn't call it emotional freedom technique. You would just say, hey, we're going to do something really, interesting here. We're going to tap on the body. And the way we start is we have about 7 points. Some people add in hands and fingers, but I don't do that. So we've got 7 points. So I don't know if you want to, you're very welcome to join in. So just tapping on the top of the head. And we're going to say some just simple things. I'm here. Do you want to repeat after me? I'm here.
I'm here.
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
I'm ready to shift.
I'm ready to shift.
It's time.
It's time.
It's time to be me.
It's time to be me.
It's fine to be me.
It's fine to be me.
I'm good enough.
I'm good enough.
I just didn't know.
I just didn't know.
All right, and just take a breath. And that's a very simple, obviously, normally I'd do many rounds, we'd change it, we'd shift you. But did anyone sort of feel anything from that? I'm good enough, I just didn't know. Does that resonate? So many people in the world don't feel good enough. They're not pretty enough, they're not smart enough, they're not sexy enough, particularly women. It affects all of us, and it's a shame state. And we need to shift that energetically, bodily. So most of the work I do involves the body. No, we won't go there. So whatever you choose to do, people, if you have children in your life, and or if you don't, and you have the inner child, the wounded child, for goodness sake, do something. Don't just sit there and suffer. Connect with people who can help you, and certainly learn some of these techniques for yourself, because they are so powerful and they're so simple. They're so simple, and they really will enhance your life and make you able to tackle anything. And I got Jane talking in front of people tonight, and then she was like, I can't do that. So we did a bit of tapping beforehand, and she did really well. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Okay, and maybe we'll do part 2 at some point. Thank you, Jane. Thank you for suggesting it. Yes.
You had EFT and you had havening. What's havening?
Well, havening is like this, and it uses similar affirmations, but and some people do it with eye movements and counting backwards. It reprograms the limbic system in the same way, but using touch instead of tapping, using stroking down the arms. Do you want to have a go?
Yeah.
I'm okay. I'm good enough. You know, whatever the issue is for you. There are many ways of explaining it. Some people think it's an energetic change. I tend towards the more scientific in that I believe this is oxytocin releasing. Yes, cuddling connection releases oxytocin in the brain. And what that does is it desensitizes the stress response. It allows things to calm down internally. And when you get that calming, then you can start to make changes in your memory and in your patterning. So, but havening is a wonderful thing. I use it probably more often than I do tapping, but I did the havening demo last time I was here, so I thought I'd do something different today. Yeah, she's had a damaged childhood of her own. Yeah, well, it'll help regulate that. It'll help them not to be so disconnected, because some of the medicines can take them out of their bodies. And for you too, it's much healthier. You know, because you're working with people who are traumatised. Absolutely. So you've got to keep grounded too.
Yeah, and I let her protect myself.
So you go in before you go in, you go, I'm okay.
Yeah.
It's not my pain. It's not mine. I'm just here to visit. I'm helping.
Yeah, okay.
Because otherwise you can take it on.
Absolutely.